Hey, you know those really cool, amazing close-up images people get? Well, that's called macro photography, and if you want to give it a go, I've got 3 ways you can try. Stick around and I'll show you all of them. Hey, how's it going? Now, anybody can do macro photography. It doesn't really matter what camera body you've got because it's all about the lenses that you're using and some modifiers that you can put onto the lenses to help you. The camera body I'm using is actually quite a good one. It's the Sony a7S II. It's a fantastic camera and it's just the one I like using all the time. And I've got 3 different lenses here that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you some modifiers on these lenses as well. So there's 3 different ways you can do macro photography. The first one is to get an actual macro lens like this one here. It says macro on it, as you can see up there, and what that means is that just in the lens there's a capability to zoom in quite close on something and get some really good detail on it. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. The next thing you've got is a more top-end lens. This is a Samyang 50mm. It's got a pretty good focus in itself, so you can get up to 45 centimeters from something, and that's its closest zoom. If you want to get closer with something like this and do macro photography, you can use some of these front-end focal magnifiers. I'll show you those in a few moments as well. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is this vintage lens that I got here. It's a rather strange beast. It's I'm not even sure what the brand is because I don't know if you can see in there, but it's Russian. It's a Russian lens. It's a 58mm and its minimal focal length is 0.5 meter, which is the longest of these 3. But it's also the one that, by using these tubes here, actually gives me the best macro photos that I've found. So I'll try all 3 of these out and show you how to fit them to the camera and see how the photos of them come out. For taking some photos, I'm going to just use this Chinese coin that I found somewhere and a few screws that I've got. I've got a loose screw or 3. None of my friends will argue with that one. And I'm going to take photos of those and just compare them. I've got my Sony camera here. This is the Sony a7S II. There are plenty of places you can go online and check out the specs of this, but short version is it's a really, really good camera for doing low light and macro photography because you can close the aperture on the lens right down to give yourself a good depth of field, and this shoots very good photos with very little light. That's why I prefer this camera for doing this sort of work. What I'm going to use first is the Canon 17-85 lens. This is a macro lens, and that means that you can focus it very, very close and zoom in at the same time. So I'm going to be hooking this one up onto the Sony camera. Now, to put a Canon lens on a Sony camera, you need an adapter. So I'll just take the end cover off there, and I'll take my adapter here, which is a EOS to NEX adapter, and I will put that onto the Canon lens here and clicking it into place. Make sure that clicks in, and then I can take the cap off here and the cap off the camera. You should always leave these open to the elements for as little time as possible. You don't want any dust getting on anything. And I'll fit that into here and turn it around till it clicks, and I've got the Canon lens on my Sony camera. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my my coins and my screws here, and I'm going to just hook the camera in, and I'll put an HDMI cable into the camera here as well, so that you can see what I'm doing as I zoom it in. I'll just turn the camera on. Now what I'm going to do is just have a look at how close I can get to these things. Now this is currently at 17mm and I can focus all the way in. Here we go. And once you're focused fully in, what you can do is just move the camera in physically. Obviously you can see that's out of focus. I can pull it out a bit more, and then I'm pretty much in focus here. As you can see, there's a reasonable distance here still between the camera lens and the stuff that I'm taking a photo of, which I'll move forward a little bit further. And if I move further back, I lose focus on it. Well, it gets smaller, but that's not ideal. Then I want to get as close as I possibly can to it without losing any focus. As you can see, that's around about there, and you can see the size of that stuff sitting in the middle of the photo. Now, with the macro lens, what that means is that when I'm on macro focus, I can zoom this lens all the way out from 17 to 85mm. And now you can see that I can get quite a bit closer, and my objects here are filling up much more of the screen. If I come too close, they're out of focus. If I move too far away, they're out of focus, but you can get that sweet spot in here. And by doing that zoom in and using the macro focal point, I can get much closer and get these things much further into shot. I'll just take a quick snap of that. There you go. And a more top-down angle snap of that as well. And that's a pretty good close-up photo just using a macro lens on a camera. But there are much better ways. You've seen all these wildlife photos where people zoom right in and get right into the detail on a small bug or something. And for doing that, you need some extra bits. Let's start by having a look at what I can put onto the Samyang 50mm lens. Okay, I'll just remove the Canon lens here from the camera, and I'll take the adapter off that, and I'll put that away. Always put the caps back on. Takes a little bit of time, but it's worth protecting what you end up spending a lot of money on with these lenses. Now what I'm going to do is take the Samyang lens here, and I will put the adapter on here, and then add the adapter back into the camera. There we go. And then I'll take a quick snap of the same thing with this camera setup. What I'll do before I start is I will open the aperture right up to t1.2, and I will make sure that I'm zoomed all the way in. There we go, so 0.45 is the focal distance on this. Now as you can see with this one, even though I've got the focal depth quite close, I need to pull quite a distance back. So this has got the second longest focal depth of these three cameras, and I'm just going to have to close the iris up a bit here so that you can see the image properly. And as you can see, I can get relatively close here, but that's about as far as I can, and this is without the adapter on. I'll take a quick shot of that. There we go. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these lens modifiers, and it's going to go onto the front of the front element on the Sony camera here. So I'll just open this up. Now this is a packet I've got of 4 of them, and they're each a different multiplier. So the first one I've got here is just a fairly mellow one. This is the smallest of the set, and I'll just take it out of its protective wrapper. Always keep those wrappers. And on here you probably can't see it. This is a +1, so it basically adds a small amount of magnification to the front of the lens. You can't really see it on this one, but it's got a convex glass on it, so it just for a small amount of magnifying. And I'll just screw that onto here a little. There we go. So that's screwed onto the front of there, and now you can see that what I'm shooting here is just a little bit larger, a little bit closer than it was before. And I'll just take a quick snap of that one as well, and I'll tighten up the aperture a bit, and just so you can get a deeper depth of field. The more you open up the aperture, so if you go from f1 to f22, you get a deeper depth of field, so more is in focus here. So if you've got it in f1, this much might be in focus. If you got it in f22, that much might be in focus. It's quite a substantial difference. So I'll just show you that one. If I open that right up, despite the fact that it's fuzzy, you can see that either one part of some of those screws is in focus. If I close it right down, you can see that all of the screws are in focus for quite a travelling distance. That's how you just change that depth of field, is by opening and closing the aperture. So anyway, I will get that there. So that's a little bit bigger than we had before. And there we go. Now what I'm going to do is replace this front magnifier with the largest one at the end of the pack. I could go through all of them, but that's not really going to serve much purpose for this. And I'm going to replace it with the 10 times magnifier, which is the one at the other end of the stack. Now this is a slightly different beast. As you can see, rather than being indistinguishably flat, that's quite a chunk of glass on the end of there. So that is a 10 times magnifier, or sorry, a plus 10 magnifier, where that was a plus 1 magnifier. But anyway, I'll put this big chunk of glass on the front of here and have another look and see what that does to the image. Now straight away here you're going to notice everything is amazingly blurry and out of focus, even though I've only got the camera the few centimeters away from the objects on the ground here. This is because the focal depth has become so short that I've got to get really in tight to get any sort of focus on here. So I'll close the aperture down a bit there, and I'm going to slow down the shutter speed as well. Now by slowing the shutter speed down, it lets more light in, but you need to be careful not to move the camera because it could blur. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the iris all the way down to f22. That means that it's the smallest hole in the end of the lens that you can get, and it's letting in the least amount of light. And at the same time I'm just slowing down my shutter speed. So where I had it shooting at 1/400th of a second before, it's now 1/20th of a second. That means I do have to hold the camera incredibly steady, but it does mean also that I'm going to get a pretty good in-focus shot of the things I've got here on the ground. And you can change the focus just by moving the camera back and forth a little bit. And that looks pretty good to me there. And I'll take a couple more from slightly different angles. So as you can see, by having the lens modifier on the front of the current lens, it shortens the focal distance, and that means I can get the camera closer to the subject, and so the subject's going to be bigger in the photo. That's a really good way of doing it if you've got these large body lenses and you can't fit something else behind it. What do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at my next lens. This is the Russian 58mm lens. I don't know what the brand is. It's got Zenit written on the cover, but I don't even know if that's the original cover for it. The name of it inside is in acrylic, so I can't pronounce that. If somebody can read that for me and leave it in the comments below, that would be most awesome, and I'd be incredibly grateful to you. What I'm going to do with this lens is I'm going to add some tubes to the back of it. I'm going to start by using all three of these tubes, and there's a 1, a 2 and a 3, and each one is progressively longer. So what I'll do is I'll just take all those and put them together here, and it just clips onto the bottom of the lens just like you would with the lens in the camera. And all of this is doing is creating extra space between the lens and the camera, so it's pushing the lens forward away from the sensor in your camera. Interesting way of doing it. So I'll take this lens off the camera, there we go, and I'll put that to one side, and then I'll shove this concoction I've got here back onto the camera, and let's have a look and see what that does for us. Well, the first thing I notice is that it's incredibly blown out, so I'm just going to close down my shutter speed from 1/20th of a second back to 1/400th, 1/500th of a second. And I'll also, on the front of the lens here, is I will reduce the focal depth to the minimum, and also I'm going to close it up so that the aperture is at 1/16th is the slowest on this one. So I've closed that up. So now I can have a bit of a play and get a better image off this. So here's the shot from the camera. As you can see, that's really blurry. and I'm only this far out from the stuff on the ground. So what I need to do here then is move in a lot closer. Wow. Now, as you can see, that is a lot closer. There's no way I could get all of those objects in shot at the same time. And I'll just take a couple of photos of that. Now, it's not hard to see that this is what you would want to be using to get, say, photos of bugs' feet and eyeballs. I can get a photo of the head of that dragon. And as you can see, the depth of field on that is incredibly narrow. In fact, it's only a few millimeters. So I'm just going to make sure that the aperture here is as wide open as I can get it. And I will mess around with the shutter speed again to try and get a better depth of field with the aperture fully closed up. That's looking quite good. As you can see, it's a bit shaky because it's zoomed in so much. What I'll do is I'll put my hand down on the ground here and rest the end of the lens on it and then move it in there. There are other tools and mechanisms that you can get to hold a camera in place while you're doing this sort of macro photography as well, and I've got a couple of things around, but I can't be bothered digging them out right at the moment. So now that I've lowered my shutter speed to 1/25th of a second and I've set the iris to f16 on this, as you can see I've got a reasonable depth of field, though that's still quite shallow, and I can get in very, very close to the dragon's head here and over to the screws that I've got on the table, so you can see some quite fine detail, say in the head around the machine screw there. And that's going to let us take some pretty awesome macro photography if I was to go and find some bugs. In fact, I did go find some bugs because I'm breeding some caterpillars in my back porch, and I popped them this morning with this very setup, and these are the photos I got. As you can see, they're pretty impressive. You can get right in on the detail of the caterpillars and see some fairly amazing stuff. And hopefully I'll get some more photos of these guys when they form chrysalis and turn into monarch butterflies as well. So there you go. That's the 3 different ways that you can do macro photography. You can either get a macro lens, which is going to get you fairly close, a lot closer than your average everyday lens is going to. You can use large format lenses and put a modifier on the front of them. That's a really good way of doing it. It's going to get you fairly close, and if you've got a longer zoom lens, the modifier is going to have a bigger effect, of course. I just stuck with the 50mm this time round because it suited me at the time. And then of course you can get the macro tubes, and you can put any combination of these 3 in. I just put all 3 on for now to try this out and have a bit of a play with it. And I just used an old lens that I actually picked this up off an auction site for $5 at some point, and it's one of my favourite lenses. Always keep an eye on auction sites for lenses. And but this combination here, it's a beautiful image that we get out of it, and yeah, I have absolutely no problems recommending this. So go and get yourself some gear. I mean, none of this stuff cost a huge amount of money. I think these macro tubes I spent about $5 on from AliExpress. The lens I got from an auction site for $5, as I said. The camera is horrifically expensive, but you don't need an expensive camera as long as you've got something with a lens mount. You can get all these different spacers and things that go with different lens mounts. In fact, this set of tubes that I've got here has separate mount types on the front and back outside of the tubes. So if you wanted, you could get a Sony set and a Nikon set and a Canon set and mix and match them as well, and even make the tubes longer and longer. And doing that creates some really fantastic close-up videos. I don't know how many tube sets you can combine and how close you could get with that. It might be an interesting experiment. I should go and do that, actually. Anyway, I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you very much for sticking around and watching it all. If you've enjoyed this, please do click in the circle over here and subscribe to the channel. And of course, don't forget there's these videos up here you can go and watch as well. Go and do that. And I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.